Chair lays out Senate Bill 1663 by Senator Creighton relating to removal, relocation of memorials located on public property. Chair recognizes Senator Creighton to explain the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members, for allowing me to come and present this bill to you today. It's during the 140 days that we're here. I know we're all focused on property tax reform and relief and school finance reform and the after effects of Harvey and so many of the main issues driving this session. We're certainly working hard to address all those issues, but there are many other issues that we have to make sure that we address while we're here in this 140-day session. And what we're going to talk about today is one of those issues that's very important to me. We're seeing across the country sort of a national movement aimed at dividing and wedging us. And in the face of a lot of this rhetoric and narrative and within certain activities within these movements, Texas needs to lead and not cave to the national trend of hiding from certain issues related to historical monuments, and instead we need to address it. The issue this bill seeks to address is the removal of historical monuments that we've seen in cities, counties, university campuses, and communities across the state. From the East Coast to California, there's a movement to hide from our past by removing important public historical monuments. Either by mob or municipal action, monuments are disappearing across the nation. Texas isn't exempt from this trend. In fact, Texas actually leads the nation in the number of certain monuments removed. And so this legislation will protect all monuments that have historical significance. Examples, the Ten Commandments that are here on the campus, monuments related to the Alamo that are here on the Capitol grounds, the San Jacinto Battle Monument, the Latino Monument, African American monuments, Union and Confederate monuments, Martin Luther King, schools named after Lincoln, streets named after General Grant. Just a few examples that this legislation would protect and preserve. We've all heard of the instances from Dallas in what was formerly Robert E. Lee Park, where a statue of him was removed and hidden on a restricted naval station property, to San Antonio's Travis Park, where the city removed a monument in the middle of the night without public discussion. Countless streets and school names have been changed across the state, and on the campus of the University of Texas at Austin, a monument was removed in lieu of placing it in a museum, prominently placed in a museum and preserved from that point forward, and that monument was essentially shoved in a dark corner where the history of the actual monument itself was depicted rather than the history of the person itself. So history was redirected and rewritten and washed. So what I hope today is, instead of monuments being removed, melted, and hidden in dark closets because of political correctness, I hope that we would allow for families, grandparents, parents, aunts and uncles, cousins, to teach their kids exactly what they need to be taught based on that family's understanding of history and where they want to see Texas going forward. And that those kids and grandkids, as we see them here on the Capitol grounds all through the year, and I park next to the Hoods Brigade Monument as an example, and I talk to families there constantly when I get in and out of my truck, just to ask them about their experience and what they're doing, standing there taking pictures and visiting and talking about that particular monument and others around the campus, and how happy they are to be able to have that right to do so. That we work together to balance the depiction of history and exactly what monuments need to be placed and erected. As under Republican governance, we've made sure, as I mentioned, the African American and Latino monument was brought forward on the Capitol grounds over the last few years, and it's one of the most visited and cherished. Both of those are two of the most cherished monuments on the grounds from the visits from all over the state and the country, and we're all very proud of them. The learning that occurs by visiting these monuments is an experience that's hard to replicate. They remind us of the high points and the low points of our history. They're a part of who we are as Texans, where we came from, what we've accomplished, what we've overcome, what we need to learn from in going forward. They motivate us to strive for excellence, to be better than our ancestors, to shape the future of our communities and our state. These monuments are to educate us and to unite us. It's a choice to make preservation of those monuments a priority, and it's a choice to tear them down and remove them and discard them. In order to accomplish this goal of protecting our historical monuments for future generations, Senate Bill 1663 creates a process for removal, relocation, altering of Texas statues, portraits, plaques, seals, symbols, building names, street names, park names, and cenotaph. First, Senate Bill 1663 protects state monuments like those removed from the University of Texas campus. If the monument is less than 20 years old, the monument may be altered by legislative action. If the monument is between 20 and 40 years old, any alteration must be approved by a 2/3 legislative vote. And if the monument is older than 40 years, then the monument is protected in perpetuity. Local monuments are also protected and can be altered by action by the governing board if it's less than 20 years old, or by voter referendum if the monument is between 20 and 40 years old. And again, if it's over 40 years old, it's protected. A violation of this bill would bring a minimum of a $1,500 fine for the first offense and $25,000 fine for subsequent offenses. And the bill also opens up the Texas Preservation Trust Fund account if there is a desire to erect additional plaques and monuments to help better depict or balance history surrounding existing monuments. If we're going to tell our story, let's tell it right. So I think we have a real solution in this bill. It doesn't include running and hiding from our past, but it includes and prioritizes addressing it head on and making sure that as I was able to grow up and walk through a park with my family to talk about the semblance of history and where we have been and where we were going forward, that we weren't required to pay admission for that. It was a privilege to be on a public ground to learn together, and that's something as a kid that I very much cherished, and that I want kids in our future for Texas to be able to have that same experience. So Texans don't hide and we don't cave. I'm sort of embarrassed from some of the rhetoric and the narrative that's been built around a lot of those efforts, and it's just important to me, Mr. Chairman, to find a way to balance our history and also preserve it so that we can continue to learn from it together and together build forward from it. And with that, I appreciate your consideration and time. The layout was a little longer, but it's an issue that's very important to me personally. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members.
I have a question of the author.
I'm sorry. Questions of the author. I'm sorry.
Yes, I do have some questions of the author, and I'm just going to limit myself to two, basically, because I think, as Senator Creighton has pointed out, this issue is personal to him. I think it's personal to a lot of us with different perspectives on the issue. And for example, you mentioned, Senator Creighton, the Ten Commandments as one of the monuments. You are aware that in Georgia they removed the Supreme Court Justice, Mr. Moore, because he insisted on having the Ten Commandments on the grounds, and the reason why they ordered him to remove it is because that violated the First Amendment, separation of church and state. So in this case, are you advocating in this bill that we maintain the Ten Commandments in some public property?
Well, I think it's a great point, Senator Rodriguez, and I'm also aware that in the state of Oklahoma, the Supreme Court allowed the Ten Commandments to remain displayed on the Capitol grounds, and so that's what I'm referring to here in this legislation, that we're talking not about interior courtrooms, but we're talking about the Capitol grounds and university campuses. We're talking about cities and counties and outdoor areas where those displays have been in place for years. Certainly, nothing here subverts the will of the courts, and what we do here is we make policy as a separate branch of government, and that's as policymakers. We've seen that many of the monuments that are displayed, it's because of the action we've taken here in the legislature, and I think this is the appropriate venue rather than the city council person of the month.
Well, so under your bill, you would, I assume that this is what would happen. Under your bill, the state would be telling local communities what to do with their monuments, even though that may be a local decision in the case of Dallas, for example, or elsewhere. That's what, I mean, instead of solving the concerns that you have, would this not open up more of a Pandora's box?
I don't believe so. You know, we have to. It's always interesting as we talk about what directives we advance for cities and counties, school districts to follow, and the like. As you know, I mean, as the states created the federal government and framework, the states also created the cities, counties, and schools, and so we're here to honor and respect local control. We're also here to act when there's local out of control.
Well, okay, last question. Recently, we've had a lot of controversy and debate over some of the Confederate monuments right here on the grounds of the Capitol, and one in particular that had the plaque that totally distorted the history of the slavery in this state and the reason why, how the state viewed secession from the Union. I think by all fair accounts, most historians agreed that that plaque did not represent the actual history. So what, and that's why the governor and the State Preservation Board got into it, and I think they ordered the removal of the plaque. So isn't that an example of where, well, I guess 2 points. One is where we have a process in place where those issues can be resolved, at least on the state properties, and secondly, a recognition that on some monuments the history is indeed distorted, and that's the reason for removing the monument. So, but under your bill, you couldn't do that.
Well, and I want to mention as well, because of a prompt from a very more than capable staff, that on your question about municipalities, my legislation does in certain circumstances allow for those in those municipalities to make the decision that should be making it, which is a vote of the people. And so there's a referendum vote provision if we do have to direct cities or counties in a certain manner on certain historical monuments. There's a referendum vote provision. But to your question about the plaque that was removed, I felt like that we made a decision was made on that by the Preservation Board that really should have been left to the legislature. I would have much more preferred, Senator Rodriguez, that you and I could have had that conversation on the Senate floor, and that it would have worked through the process, very open and public. So in a venue like this, that those that travel from all over the state and further, that could have had a say about that particular move, that they would have felt heard, as they will feel today because of Chairman Birdwell's the way he handles his committee and the way that this process is set up. I also feel like that very good people on that Preservation Board committee, but interestingly enough, from the legislators and their representation on that particular board, none of them have absolutely a thing to do with Senate District 4. None of them. And so with the consideration of removing that plaque, I think it as it was erected by the legislature, I think that it would have been more proper through a process where everyone is heard that would have been the case, and that we would have been able to advance through the process and have this discussion on the floor, because I think it's a very healthy discussion. Thank you, sir.
We may still have the discussion on the floor on this bill. Thank you for answering my question.
Listen, and I have great respect for
Yes,
you,
sir.
and that's the kind of discussion that I think is healthy for our districts. And thank you, Senator Rodriguez,
Thank you for
asking
answering
the
my question.
question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Zeffironi.
Senator Daniel Miller.
No worries. All right, thank you to the committee. My name is Daniel Miller, and I am here representing the members and supporters of the Texas Nationalist movement, and we are in strong support of this bill. To eliminate some of the rhetoric, fiery rhetoric that has a tendency to go along with this, let me just reemphasize what this does. This bill seeks to eliminate uncertainty by giving a consistent, predictable statutory framework in which the issues of how to properly memorialize our history and culture can be handled. It protects pieces of history that have been in place for a minimum of one generation, gives the people a voice in what to do with the monuments and memorials that are newer, and it sits perfectly alongside the existing ability of all political subdivisions to erect new monuments, markers, and memorials. Our history and the markers, monuments, and memorials to it must be protected, and that means all of it, good and bad, no matter how it's perceived. Equal to those protections, though, should be our commitment to the fundamental principle which has been articulated in every governing document that Texas has ever had. I've said this time and time again in front of committees on this issue and many others, but I have to remind people of Article 1, Section 2 of the Texas Constitution, which begins with the words, "All political power is inherent in the people." This bill seeks, in a very rational, thoughtful way, to finally involve all of the people in the process. Almost never in this process are the people given a true voice at the ballot box in how these matters are decided. Instead, elected officials hold public meetings where debate is often stifled and the outcomes predetermined. Frustrated by the charade, these meetings invariably degenerate into angry outbursts from both sides whose passions have been inflamed by politicians whose only measure of success is in the number of votes they'll receive in the next election or the number of column inches they'll receive in tomorrow's newspaper. It is time to protect our history and give the people of Texas a permanent seat at the table, and I ask for your favorable consideration of this legislation.
Thank you. Are there questions?